When hinges creak in doorless chambers, and strange and frightening sounds echo through the halls, whenever candle lights flicker where the air is deathly still, that is the time when ghosts are present, practicing their terror with ghoulish delight. Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Haunted Mansion. Welcome to Teacup For One. My name is Halloween Matt, and I have 2 degrees. And welcome to this year's Halloween series, Grinning, Ghost Stories. Each week we'll be looking at one of the 999 happy haunts from Disney's Haunted Mansion and examining the real-life ghost stories which inspired them. This week's happy haunts need no introduction, but let me just say, beware of Hitchhiking Ghosts. The Hitchhiking Ghosts are some of the most popular, or at the very least, most merchandised characters from Disney's Haunted Mansion. They appear famously at the end of the attraction. Just as you're exiting the graveyard, your ghost host tells you to beware of Hitchhiking Ghosts. They appear, and the ghost host informs you that they have chosen you to become the mansion's final resident. And then they appear in the mirror in your ride vehicle. Everyone laughs and the ghost host says, "A ghost will follow you home." And these ghosts are extra special because they were in fact named by Haunted Mansion cast members. Back in the early days of the Haunted Mansion, the ghost characters were mostly unnamed, so Haunted Mansion cast members took it upon themselves to create a catalog naming every ghost and giving them a well-thought-out, intricate backstory. This collection of ghost stories was known as the Ghost Gallery. Much of the information contained within the Ghost Gallery eventually fell out of date as Disney began to create their own backstories and their own names for the characters populating the Haunted Mansion. However, when it came time to assign official names to those 3 hitchhiking ghosts, Disney drew from the unofficial names given to them by the cast members all those years before: Phineas, Ezra, and Gus. And as far as I know, this is one of the only times that fanon became canon. Fanon is fan canon. It's fan fiction. Fanon, it's clever because it rhymes. But fanon aside, the Hitchhiking Ghosts, like most of the ghosts in the Haunted Mansion, were inspired by real-life ghost stories, or in this case, urban legends. Versions of this story have existed for centuries, but the Hitchhiking Ghost as an urban legend has really spiked over the last 100 years or so. I think its popularity as an urban legend can be traced back to a radio play from the early 1940s by Lucille Fletcher called The Hitchhiker, and the radio play's adaptation for an episode of The Twilight Zone. In Fletcher's Hitchhiker story, a person is driving across the country by themselves, and as they pass through different states, they continue to see the same hitchhiker who keeps trying to flag them down. Eventually, the driver realizes that they died in a car crash days earlier, and the hitchhiker they've been seeing is death. This is why I think that is a fascinating twist ending, because for a twist ending to work, you need to go against audience expectations. And this is no different. You expect that the hitchhiker will be the ghost, when in fact it turns out that the driver is the ghost. But what I find fascinating is that this is a twist ending to a story that really didn't have a place in mainstream media. Lucille Fletcher wrote The Hitchhiker in the early 1940s, and yes, it went against audience expectations, and it was a story that everyone knew. But it wasn't a story that everyone knew from past radio plays, or films, or TV shows. It was a story everyone knew, because they had already heard it from a friend of a friend. By all reports, hitchhiking ghost stories were thriving as urban legends in the early 1940s, and that's not an exaggeration. There was a literal report that was published in 1942 outlining a study that was conducted to track down anyone who had a hitchhiking ghost story. In 1942, the California Folklore Quarterly published an article by Richard K. Beardsley and Rosalie Hankey called The Vanishing Hitchhiker. They collected accounts from 79 different people who all had hitchhiking ghost stories, but in classic urban legend fashion, most of these stories happened to a friend of a friend. The authors of this article really seemed to be approaching their study from an anthropological perspective. They were in no way entertaining the possibility that these ghost stories could be true. Instead, they wanted to see if it was possible that one story evolved into creating all 79 different accounts, almost as if they were tracking the evolution of a never-ending game of broken telephone. And in their defense, the stories that they collected were so similar that there was a definite case to be made for all of them coming from the same encounter. Nearly every version of the story involves a male driver driving by himself in the middle of the night when he comes across a female hitchhiker on the side of the road. He invites her into the vehicle, asks her where she's headed, and then, while he's en route to her destination, she disappears while the vehicle is in motion. In some versions of the story, the driver continues to the address provided by the hitchhiker. When he arrives at the house, he's met by an old woman. He asks where Betsy is, and she responds,
"Betsy's been dead for 10 years.
In other versions of the story, the driver will lend the hitchhiker his coat or his scarf, and he later finds them in a cemetery, neatly folded on top of a headstone of a deceased young woman who looks suspiciously like his passenger. Given that so many of these hitchhiking ghost stories collected in the 1940s were so similar, it's fair to assume that they were all variations of the same encounter, which may or may not have happened. But then there's the other possibility, that hitchhiking ghost encounters are not isolated incidents. And there's a case to be made for this. Over the past few decades, there's been better documentation, and there have been several first-hand accounts of people from around the world claiming to have encountered hitchhiking ghosts. For example, there's a famous hitchhiking ghost story from Uniondale, South Africa. A woman died in a car crash in the 1960s, and a few years later, people started to see her hitchhiking along the road where she died. There were some reports of car doors opening and closing by themselves as the vehicle was in motion, numerous reports of a shrill laugh or scream, and there was one motorcyclist who reported that while he was driving down the road, he could feel a pair of arms wrapping around him as though there was someone sitting behind him, going along for the ride. These sightings went on for over 10 years and reportedly stopped once the woman's boyfriend, who survived the car crash, eventually died in the 1980s. There were also reports of a long-haired male hitchhiking spirit who appeared to multiple motorists on the New York Thruway in the early 1970s. He would get into the vehicle, strike up a conversation about Judgment Day, before mysteriously vanishing. But one of the most notable and believable hitchhiking ghost stories occurred in Bedfordshire, England, in 1979. A lot of these hitchhiking ghost stories seem to happen in the 70s. Like, I'm not saying it's because of the recreational activities from the 1970s, but I'm not saying it's not. A 26-year-old man named Roy Fulton was driving alone one night when he came across a young male hitchhiker on the side of the road. He pulled over, invited the hitchhiker into his vehicle, and asked the passenger where he was headed. The hitchhiker didn't say a word. He just pointed straight ahead. After minutes of driving and not hearing his passenger speak a single word, Fulton decided to offer him a cigarette. He reached down for the cigarette, looked back up, and his guest was nowhere to be seen. So he did what any sensible person would do. He found the first available pub, went in, ordered a drink, and told everyone that he saw a ghost, and he was understandably freaked the bleep out. And this was an encounter that stayed with him for a while. According to his wife, he insisted that they sleep with the lights on, and he was constantly paranoid that this ghost was going to follow him home. In classic Haunted Mansion style. Okay, Whether or not any of these stories actually happened is of course up for debate. But there is something undeniably frightening about driving alone in an unknown area in the middle of the night. Between the darkness and the unfamiliar terrain and the isolation, it is entirely possible that a solo driver's imagination could go into overdrive. But it's also possible that between the isolation and the darkness, a solo driver could become more attuned to wandering spirits, just looking to hitch a ride. Anyway, friends, this concludes the first episode of the Teacup For One Grim, Grinning Ghost Story series. Let me know in the comment section down below. Have you encountered a hitchhiking ghost? Or do you have a friend who's encountered a hitchhiking ghost? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you want to be the first to know when I upload more scary stories, or when I upload videos about Disney, Shakespeare, Funko Pops, sometimes cats, make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. If you haven't subscribed already, it is scarily easy. All you have to do is click on my face. Thanks for joining me tonight, everyone. My name is Halloween Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the Teacup For One. Boo!